I'm carrying your husband's child," my daughter-in-law whispered into my ear during our family anniversary dinner. And somehow, the sound of silverware clinking against china kept going like nothing in the world had changed. I sat perfectly still at the end of the dining table while laughter drifted around the room like warm smoke. My son Ryan was pouring wine for everyone. My husband Thomas was telling one of his old stories about a golf trip in Arizona. Outside the windows, the backyard lights glowed softly against the dark October sky, and the fountain Thomas installed 5 summers ago hummed quietly beside the rose bushes. 40 years of marriage. That was what we were celebrating that night. 40 years of building a family, raising a son, hosting Christmas dinners, paying mortgages, surviving illnesses, and believing loyalty meant something sacred. Sophie stood beside me holding the empty dessert tray, smiling so politely that anyone watching us would have thought she was asking whether I wanted more cheesecake. But I heard every word clearly. "The baby is Thomas's." Then she walked away before I could even turn toward her. I didn't react. I didn't gasp or knock over my wine glass or accuse anyone of anything. I simply lowered my fork onto the plate and folded my hands carefully in my lap. Years ago, when I was younger, maybe I would have caused a scene. Maybe I would have demanded explanations in front of everyone. But age teaches you something important. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. Across the table, Ryan laughed at something his father said, completely unaware that his entire life had just cracked open beside him. He looked tired lately. The long hours at the architecture firm were wearing him down, putting silver at his temples before he'd even turned 40. Still, every time he smiled at Sophie, there was trust in his eyes. Real trust. The kind that made my chest ache. Sophie returned to her seat beside him and rested one hand gently against her stomach for only a second before lifting her wine glass again. It was such a small movement that no one else would have noticed it. But I did. I noticed everything after that. The way Thomas suddenly avoided looking directly at me. The nervous twitch in Sophie's jaw whenever Ryan mentioned the future. The strange silence that settled over the table every time I spoke. I reached for my water glass because my throat had gone dry. The ice cubes had already melted. "You okay, Mom?" Ryan asked casually. I looked at my son, at the same blue eyes I'd once watched open for the first time in a hospital room nearly 4 decades ago. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle in our cul-de-sac. I remembered staying awake all night when he had pneumonia at 8 years old. I remembered how proud Thomas had been the day Ryan graduated college. Families are strange that way. You spend years building something sturdy, never realizing termites have already gotten inside the walls. "I'm fine," I said softly. And strangely enough, I meant it. Because beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation beginning to spread through my chest like cold water, something else had appeared. Clarity. Tiny moments from the past few months started rearranging themselves inside my mind, like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. Sophie showing up at the house while Ryan was traveling for work. Thomas suddenly caring about his appearance again after years of barely noticing mirrors. Secretive phone calls. Closed office doors. Late-night business meetings that somehow always seemed to happen when Ryan was out of town. I had seen the signs. I just never allowed myself to imagine something this ugly hiding underneath them. The dining room suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. Candlelight flickered against the crystal glasses, throwing shadows across everyone's faces. Thomas finally glanced toward me, and for one brief second, guilt flashed in his eyes before disappearing behind another sip of wine. That hurt more than Sophie's whisper. Not the betrayal itself. The cowardice. The fact that he was willing to let me sit there looking foolish in my own home while he pretended everything was normal. Sophie leaned against Ryan's shoulder as he showed her something on his phone, smiling with practiced sweetness. Watching them together made my stomach tighten. Not because of jealousy. Because Ryan still had no idea the people he trusted most had already turned his life into a lie. I stared down at the untouched slice of cheesecake on my plate while the conversation drifted around me. The blueberries on top had started bleeding into the cream. Somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed quietly. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. But nothing inside that house was ordinary anymore. And as I sat there surrounded by my family, I realized something terrifying. Sophie wasn't nervous when she whispered her secret to me. She was confident, which meant she believed she had already won. I barely slept that night. Thomas lay beside me, breathing steadily in the dark while I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above our bed. 40 years together, and suddenly the silence between us felt unfamiliar. The digital clock beside his side of the bed glowed bright red against the darkness. 2:13 in the morning, then 3:47, then 5:12. Time kept moving even though my life no longer felt real. Around 6, Thomas got out of bed quietly and headed downstairs. I waited until I heard the coffee machine start before following him. The kitchen smelled like French roast and cinnamon bread from the bakery down the street. Ordinary smells, ordinary routines. Thomas stood at the counter reading emails on his phone while sunlight crept through the windows above the sink. For a moment, he looked exactly like the man I married at 23. Broad shoulders, silver hair carefully combed back, calm posture, reliable, familiar. It almost made me angry how normal he looked. "You are up early," he said without turning around. "Could not sleep," I answered. He nodded once, still staring at his phone screen. That was when I noticed it again. The distance. Months ago, I told myself Thomas had simply become quieter with age. Men changed after retirement. They became restless, distracted. But now every small moment felt different under the weight of what Sophie had told me. Thomas locking his office door. Thomas taking evening drives alone. Thomas suddenly buying expensive cologne after years of using the same aftershave from the drugstore. I poured myself coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug. It was still too hot to drink. "Ryan called last night after dinner," Thomas said carefully. "He and Sophie are thinking about taking a trip to Napa next month." Sophie. Even hearing her name made something tighten inside my chest now. "That sounds nice," I replied. Thomas finally looked at me then, studying my face carefully as if searching for signs of damage. Maybe he expected screaming. Maybe guilt had kept him awake too. But I had learned something during the long years of marriage and motherhood. People became careless when they believed you were weak. So I smiled faintly and asked whether he wanted eggs or oatmeal for breakfast. Confusion flickered across his expression before disappearing again. "Oatmeal is fine," he muttered. I turned toward the stove so he would not see the coldness settling behind my eyes. By noon, Thomas had left for what he called a lunch meeting downtown. I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes while the house hummed quietly around me. Our home sat on a peaceful street outside Portland where maple trees lined the sidewalks and neighbors still waved from driveways. We had raised Ryan here. Every corner carried memories. Height marks on the laundry room wall from Ryan growing up. Christmas ornaments collected over 4 decades. The back patio where Thomas once promised we would grow old together. I used to think betrayal arrived loudly, like shattered glass or slamming doors. But real betrayal was quieter than that. It settled into a house slowly, changing the temperature 1 degree at a time until suddenly everything felt cold. Around 1:30, Sophie stopped by unexpectedly. She claimed she was dropping off leftovers from dinner, but Ryan was not with her. She stepped into the kitchen wearing cream-colored yoga clothes and oversized sunglasses even though clouds covered the sky outside. "Ryan is at the office," she explained casually while setting containers on the counter. "I figured you and Thomas might want these." "Thomas. Not Dad. Not your father-in-law. Thomas. I noticed that too." "That was thoughtful," I said. Sophie removed her sunglasses slowly and studied me with careful eyes. She was beautiful in the polished way magazine women always seemed beautiful. Perfect hair, smooth skin, controlled smile. Afternoon. The rain had become heavier, turning the backyard gray and blurry beyond the windows. I was folding laundry in the upstairs hallway when my phone rang. Clara Bennett's name appeared on the screen. I had known Clara for nearly 30 years. She and her husband used to vacation with Thomas and me before the divorce changed her life. Afterward, she became sharper somehow, more observant, less trusting of appearances. "Evelyn," she said carefully after I answered. "Do you have a minute?" Something in her voice made me sit down slowly on the hallway bench. "Of course." Clara hesitated for a second. I was not sure whether to call. "But after seeing Thomas at the marina again yesterday, I think you deserve to know something." My fingers tightened around the phone. "The marina?" "Evelyn," she said quietly. "I have seen him there several times over the past 6 months. Not alone." I closed my eyes briefly. Somewhere downstairs, the dryer buzzed softly. "With Sophie?" Silence answered me first. Then Clara exhaled slowly. "Yes." Hearing another person confirm it changed something inside me. Until that moment, part of me had still hoped this was some twisted misunderstanding. But now the truth sat fully formed between us. Ugly, humiliating, real. Clara continued carefully, as if choosing each word with precision. Last month I saw them having lunch together near the Marina Cafe. I almost walked over to say hello, but something about the way they were acting felt wrong. Wrong how? I whispered. Too comfortable, she replied softly. Not like family. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Why did you not tell me before? Because I prayed I was mistaken. Her voice cracked slightly. And because I know how much your family means to you. I stared out the upstairs window at the rainwater sliding down the glass in crooked lines. Family. Such a beautiful word for something capable of destroying you quietly. Clara lowered her voice. There is something else. I said nothing. My nephew works in commercial real estate downtown. He mentioned Thomas recently purchased a condo through a shell company near the waterfront. The hallway suddenly felt smaller around me. A condo. Yes. Fully furnished. Monthly payments started almost a year ago. Almost a year. I thought about all the evenings Thomas claimed he was attending business dinners. All the weekends Ryan traveled for projects in Seattle or San Francisco, while Sophie conveniently stayed behind. My stomach turned cold. Are you still there? Clara asked gently. Yes. I am sorry, Evelyn. I looked down at the wedding ring still resting on my left hand. Thomas bought it in 1984 after his first major promotion. I remembered crying when he slipped it onto my finger because we finally felt financially secure after years of struggling. We had celebrated with cheap champagne and Chinese takeout in our tiny apartment. Back then, love felt simple. Honest. Do not be sorry, I said quietly. Just tell me everything you know. Clara hesitated again before speaking. People around town have noticed them together, Evelyn. More than once. I think they assumed you already knew. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Not the affair itself. Not even Sophie's cruel confidence. It was realizing I had become the last person to see what everyone else already understood. After the call ended, I remained seated in the hallway while thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Downstairs, the grandfather clock ticked steadily beside the front staircase. Every sound inside the house suddenly felt too loud, too sharp. I stood slowly and walked into the bedroom Thomas and I had shared for 4 decades. His side of the closet smelled faintly of cedar and cologne. I reached toward one of his jacket pockets without really knowing why. Inside, my fingers brushed against a receipt. I unfolded it carefully. Dinner for 2. Waterfront Grill. Tuesday night. The same Tuesday Thomas told me he was stuck in traffic after a charity board meeting. At the bottom of the receipt, written in neat handwriting, was a short message. Thank you for another beautiful night. S. The next few days passed with a strange kind of calmness that frightened me more than anger would have. Thomas moved through the house exactly as he always had. He watered the roses every morning before breakfast. He watched financial news with the television volume too loud. He kissed my cheek before leaving the house, and every time his lips touched my skin, I felt the weight of the lies hiding underneath that small gesture. Sophie continued calling me almost daily. Her voice sounded warm and respectful on the surface, but now I could hear something underneath it. Testing. Watching. Waiting to see whether I would break apart. I did not give her that satisfaction. Instead, I started paying attention. Real attention. I noticed Thomas becoming protective of his phone whenever messages appeared. I noticed Sophie wearing a necklace Thomas had supposedly bought years ago for me during a canceled anniversary trip to Napa. I noticed Ryan becoming more exhausted every week, while the 2 people betraying him somehow looked lighter, almost relieved. One Thursday afternoon, Ryan stopped by the house unexpectedly. He loosened his tie as he walked into the kitchen and collapsed into one of the stools near the island. Long week, he muttered. I handed him coffee without asking because mothers never stop noticing what their children need, even after they become grown men with careers and mortgages. He smiled tiredly. You always know. That nearly broke my heart. Ryan sat there rubbing his forehead while rain tapped gently against the skylight above us. Sophie has been acting strange lately, he admitted quietly. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. Strange how? Distracted. He stared down into his coffee cup. She disappears for hours sometimes and says she is shopping or meeting friends, but lately everything feels off. I said nothing. Ryan let out a tired laugh. Maybe I am just stressed. I looked at my son carefully. There were dark circles under his eyes now. He had lost weight over the past few months. Suddenly, I realized something painful. While I had been grieving my marriage, Ryan had been slowly losing his own life without understanding why. Have you talked to her? I asked gently. He shrugged. Every time I try, she turns it around and asks why I am being paranoid. Paranoid. That word lingered in my mind after he left. It was always the same with people like Sophie. They rewrote reality slowly enough that everyone around them began doubting themselves instead. That evening, Thomas claimed he had another dinner meeting downtown. I watched him knot his tie carefully in the hallway mirror while soft jazz played from the kitchen radio. "Do not wait up for me," he said casually. I smiled faintly from the living room sofa. I probably will not. The front door closed behind him a few moments later. Then silence settled over the house again. I waited exactly 15 minutes before picking up my car keys. The streets were slick from rain as I drove downtown beneath blurred streetlights and glowing restaurant signs. Portland always looked beautiful at night in the rain. Quiet, reflective, like a city trying to hide its secrets beneath the shine of wet pavement. I parked half a block from the waterfront district and sat inside the car, watching people move beneath umbrellas along the sidewalk. At 7:43, Thomas appeared outside the restaurant Clara had mentioned earlier that week. He was not alone. Sophie stepped out behind him wearing a cream-colored coat and laughing softly at something he said. Seeing them together with my own eyes felt strangely different from hearing about it. More intimate, more humiliating. Thomas touched the small of her back as they crossed the sidewalk. Such a familiar gesture. He used to guide me the same way through crowded airports and busy parking lots. For a moment, I could not breathe properly. But then something unexpected happened. The pain shifted, not disappeared, just changed shape. Watching them together, I suddenly saw how ridiculous they looked. An aging man desperate to feel important again. A younger woman studying him carefully like an investment portfolio. There was no love in the way Sophie looked at Thomas. No warmth. Only calculation. I stayed in the car while they disappeared into a luxury condo building across the street from the marina. The same building Clara mentioned. Rain rolled slowly down my windshield while the parking meter blinked red beside the curb. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes staring at the entrance doors. Then my phone buzzed. Ryan's name lit up the screen. "Hey, Mom," he said after I answered. "Do you know where Sophie is? She said she was having dinner with you tonight." I closed my eyes briefly as rain continued tapping against the roof of the car. Across the street, the elevator lights inside the condo building moved slowly upward. "No," I said quietly. "She is not with me." Silence filled the line for a few seconds. Then Ryan spoke again, softer this time. "That is strange." I looked toward the glowing windows high above the marina and realized the worst betrayal inside that family was no longer happening between husband and wife. It was happening between parent and child. After Ryan ended the call, I remained parked across from the marina long after the rain stopped. The windshield had begun fogging around the edges, blurring the city lights into soft gold smears against the darkness. Somewhere above those glowing condo windows, my husband and daughter-in-law were building a future from the ruins of our family. But the longer I sat there, the more something about the situation stopped making sense. Sophie was too careful, too strategic. Women like her did not gamble their lives recklessly unless there was something larger waiting at the end. When I finally drove home, the house was dark except for the small lamp glowing beside Thomas's recliner in the living room. I did not turn on any other lights. Instead, I sat alone at the kitchen table listening to the refrigerator hum softly in the silence. My wedding ring felt unusually heavy against my hand. Around midnight, Thomas came home. I heard his car pull slowly into the driveway before his footsteps crossed the front porch. He entered quietly, probably assuming I was asleep upstairs. But when he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, something flickered across his face. Surprise first, then caution. "You are still awake," he said. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 12:18 in the morning. Long meeting. He loosened his tie carefully without meeting my eyes. Traffic was terrible downtown. The lie came so naturally now. That was the frightening part. Not the affair itself, but how easily deception had woven itself into our daily life. Thomas poured water into a glass and stood at the sink, drinking slowly while his reflection stared back from the dark kitchen window. For the first time in 40 years, he felt like a stranger standing in my home. "Ryan called earlier," I said quietly. Thomas froze almost imperceptibly. Oh, he was looking for Sophie. Silence stretched between us. Then Thomas nodded once and rinsed the glass carefully beneath running water. I imagined she was out shopping or something. Shopping. At midnight. I watched him dry the glass with steady hands while a strange realization settled over me. Thomas genuinely believed he could continue lying forever. Not because he was intelligent, because he thought I would protect the family image no matter what he did. Men like Thomas spent decades depending on women like me to carry the emotional weight of the household while they moved carelessly through life expecting forgiveness to appear automatically. But forgiveness and blindness were not the same thing. The next morning, I called Clara again. We met for lunch at a quiet cafe outside downtown where retired couples usually spend afternoons discussing grandchildren and vacation plans. Clara arrived wearing a navy wool coat and carrying a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. The moment she sat down, I knew she had more to tell me. "You look tired," she said gently. "I am past tired." She hesitated before sliding the folder carefully across the table toward me. "I probably should not have done this," she admitted quietly. Inside were photocopies, property records, financial statements, trust documents. I stared down at the pages while the cafe noise faded around me. Thomas had transferred large amounts of money over the last year into accounts connected to the condo. Expensive furniture purchases, jewelry payments, vacation reservations. But one detail made my stomach turn cold. Sophie's name appeared beside almost every transaction. "This is not just an affair," Clara said softly. "No," I turned another page slowly. "It is something else." At the bottom of one statement was the name of a legal firm specializing in estate restructuring and inheritance protection. I stared at it for several seconds before understanding finally settled into place. Sophie was not trying to steal a husband. She was trying to position herself inside the Brooks family fortune permanently. Suddenly her confidence made perfect sense. The pregnancy announcement, the whispered confession, the complete lack of shame. She believed she was securing her future. "Ryan has no idea," Clara murmured. I looked out the cafe window where fallen leaves skittered across wet sidewalks in the wind. "No," I answered quietly. "And that is the cruelest part." Clara folded her hands together carefully. "What are you going to do?" I thought about Ryan sitting exhausted in my kitchen only yesterday, blaming himself for the distance growing inside his marriage. I thought about Thomas calmly lying to my face after midnight. I thought about Sophie touching her stomach with that victorious little smile during our anniversary dinner. Then I closed the folder gently. "I am going to let them keep talking," I said. Clara frowned slightly. "Evelyn, people reveal everything when they think they are winning." The waitress arrived with fresh coffee then, interrupting us briefly. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug while steam curled upward between us. Outside, the rain had started again. Soft, steady, endless. And for the first time since Sophie whispered her secret into my ear, I stopped feeling like the victim sitting at the table. Because now I finally understood the real game being played inside my family. And I had no intention of losing. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone my family no longer recognized. Not because I changed loudly, but because I stopped reacting the way they expected me to. I smiled during Sunday dinners. I asked Ryan about work projects. I complimented Sophie on a new coat she wore to brunch one Saturday afternoon. I even listened patiently while Thomas talked about replacing the deck in the backyard next spring. The performance exhausted me, but it served a purpose. The calmer I appeared, the more careless they became. Sophie especially. She started spending more time at the house, while Ryan worked late downtown. Sometimes she wandered through rooms slowly, studying furniture and artwork with a thoughtful expression that no longer escaped my notice. One afternoon, I found her standing inside my walk-in closet upstairs. "I was looking for the guest towels," she explained smoothly when she saw me in the doorway. "Guest towels? In my bedroom closet." I simply smiled and handed her the towels myself. But later that night, I opened the safe hidden behind the winter coats and removed every important document inside. Trust agreements, property deeds, investment records. I placed them carefully into a locked leather briefcase and drove them the next morning to a private safety deposit box downtown. Thomas noticed the safe was empty 3 days later. "Did you move the paperwork somewhere?" he asked casually over breakfast. I spread jam across toast without looking up. I wanted to organize things. He nodded once, pretending not to care, but I noticed how his jaw tightened slightly afterward. Fear was beginning to enter the room now. Small at first, barely visible, like smoke under a door. A few days later, Clara called while I was grocery shopping. "I think you need to see something," she said quietly. We met at her condo that evening overlooking the river. Clara worked part-time helping a financial consultant organize archived records, which meant people often spoke freely around her without realizing how much she noticed. She handed me a printed email chain she had accidentally come across while reviewing corporate correspondence connected to Thomas's former investment group. Sophie's name appeared repeatedly. So did Thomas's. But one sentence near the bottom froze me completely. "Once the trust restructuring is complete, Ryan will not need direct access immediately." Sophie had responded underneath it only 3 minutes later. "Good. The less he understands now, the easier everything will be after the baby arrives." I read the exchange twice while a cold heaviness settled through my chest. Ryan was not simply being betrayed emotionally. They were preparing to isolate him financially too. Clara sat quietly across from me while city lights shimmered through the condo windows behind her. "I am sorry," she murmured. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back onto the table. "No," I said softly. "Now I finally understand everything." Thomas and Sophie were not driven by love. They were driven by access. Access to family wealth. Access to property. Access to stability and status. Thomas probably believed Sophie made him feel young again, desired again. But Sophie saw something far more practical. A wealthy older man with influence over family assets and enough guilt to manipulate easily. And Ryan, my sweet loyal son, stood directly in the path of all of it without realizing he was being slowly pushed aside. That realization hardened something inside me permanently. The following Sunday, I invited everyone to dinner again. "Just family," I said warmly when Ryan called to confirm. "I thought it would be nice." Thomas glanced at me strangely after I hung up the phone, but he said nothing. That afternoon, I cooked every meal Thomas loved most. Rosemary chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, honey glazed carrots, fresh sourdough from the bakery near the marina. The house filled with warm, familiar smells while Frank Sinatra played softly through the kitchen speakers. For years, preparing dinner had been my way of holding the family together. That night, it became something else entirely. Sophie arrived wearing soft beige cashmere and a delicate gold bracelet I recognized immediately because Thomas had once given me the matching necklace on our 20th anniversary. Ryan carried a bottle of red wine and kissed my cheek when he walked in. "You look good, Mom," he said with tired sincerity. My chest tightened again. He still trusted all of us. Every single one. During dinner, conversation drifted politely across the table while rain tapped against the windows outside. Sophie rested one hand against her stomach now more openly than before. Thomas kept refilling everyone's glasses too quickly. Nervous habit. Ryan talked about expanding his firm into Seattle next year. "That sounds exciting," Sophie said softly without really listening. Her attention kept drifting toward Thomas whenever Ryan looked away. By dessert, the tension beneath the tablecloth had become almost visible. Then Ryan smiled suddenly. "You know," he said warmly, "despite everything lately, I am really grateful we are all together tonight." Silence followed that sentence for half a heartbeat too long. Sophie lowered her eyes toward her wineglass. Thomas reached for his napkin unnecessarily, and I realized none of them understood yet that this dinner was not about preserving the family anymore. It was about exposing what had already destroyed it. Ryan's words lingered over the table after everyone fell silent. The candles flickered softly between us, reflecting against crystal glasses and polished silverware, while rain whispered steadily outside the dining room windows. For one strange moment, the entire room looked exactly the way family dinners were supposed to look. Warm light, familiar faces, shared history. But I had finally learned something painful about appearances. They were often the last refuge of broken people. I set my napkin carefully beside my plate and stood from the table. "I almost forgot," I said calmly. "I have something for all of you." Sophie looked up immediately. Thomas straightened slightly in his chair. Ryan smiled faintly, still unaware of the storm, sitting quietly inside the room with us. I walked into my office near the front hallway and returned carrying a dark leather folder, the same one Clara had seen at the cafe days earlier. I placed it gently onto the dining table beside the dessert plates. Nobody moved at first. "What is that?" Thomas finally asked. His voice sounded controlled. but I noticed how tightly his hand gripped the stem of his wine glass. Just some things I think this family needs to discuss honestly. Ryan glanced between us with confusion beginning to creep across his face. Sophie remained very still. Too still. I opened the folder slowly and removed several sheets of paper. Property transfers. Financial statements. Copies of email exchanges. I slid them across the table toward Ryan first. "Mom," he said quietly as he picked them up. "What is this?" "Read them." The only sound in the room came from paper shifting between Ryan's hands and rain striking the windows outside. Across from him, Sophie's face had begun losing color. Thomas looked toward me with something darker than guilt now. Fear. Ryan's eyes moved faster over the documents with every passing second. "What am I looking at?" he asked, though his voice no longer sounded steady. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. Money transferred from family accounts into the waterfront condo. Ryan frowned. "What condo?" No one answered immediately. Sophie finally inhaled sharply beside him. "Ryan, this is not what it looks like." "Then explain it," I said softly. She turned toward me with sudden anger flashing through her polished composure. "You went through our private information?" "Our. Not mine and Ryan's. Hers and Thomas's." Ryan noticed it too. I watched confusion slowly give way to something more painful behind his eyes. "Sophie," he said carefully, "why is your name on these accounts with my father?" Thomas stood abruptly from the table then, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Enough," he snapped. "This conversation is inappropriate." But I was no longer afraid of Thomas's voice. Not after seeing the small, frightened man hiding underneath it. "Sit down," I said quietly. And to my surprise, he did. Ryan looked physically ill now. He flipped through another page, then another. Receipts from restaurants. Condo maintenance payments. Jewelry purchases. Private travel reservations. All connected through shell accounts and redirected funds. "Dad," Ryan whispered. Thomas stared down at the untouched cheesecake melting slowly on his plate. "Ryan, it is complicated." "Complicated?" Ryan's voice cracked sharply for the first time all evening. "Why are you and my wife tied to secret property accounts?" Sophie reached for his arm, but he pulled away immediately. The movement seemed to shock her more than the documents themselves. "Ryan, please let me explain." I opened the folder again and removed one final sheet of paper. Then I slid it carefully across the table toward him. The room became completely silent. Ryan stared at the document for several long seconds before lifting his eyes towards Sophie in disbelief. "You told me the baby was early because of stress," he said quietly. Sophie's lips parted, but no words came out. "Ryan." Thomas began weakly, but Ryan turned toward him with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before. Betrayal. Pure and devastating. "How long?" he asked. Nobody answered. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the river. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hallway beyond the dining room. Every second felt unbearably loud now. Sophie finally straightened in her chair, and for the first time since all of this began, the sweetness disappeared entirely from her voice. "You are all acting like I manipulated this by myself." Ryan stared at her in stunned silence. "What does that mean?" She laughed once softly, bitterly. "Your father made promises too." Thomas closed his eyes briefly like a man watching his own life collapse in slow motion. Sophie looked directly at me then. "You think this family was healthy before I arrived?" Her words hung coldly in the room. Everyone here was already pretending long before me. I looked at her carefully across the candlelight. Maybe she believed that. Maybe people who destroyed families always convinced themselves the damage existed before they touched anything. But there was one difference between Sophie and me. I still understood what loyalty was supposed to mean. Ryan suddenly stood from the table, so quickly his wine glass tipped over beside him. Dark red liquid spreading slowly across the white tablecloth, like a stain nobody could stop anymore. Then he looked at both of them and asked the question that finally shattered what remained of our family. Was any of it real? Ryan's question lingered in the dining room like smoke after a fire. Nobody answered him immediately because sometimes the truth arrives too late for words to matter. Sophie stared down at the wine spreading across the white tablecloth while Thomas rubbed one hand against his forehead like a man suddenly realizing age could not protect him from consequences. Ryan looked from one face to the other, searching desperately for someone to deny everything. Someone to tell him this nightmare had been exaggerated or misunderstood. But silence has its own language, and by then he understood it perfectly. Ryan, I said gently, sit down. He remained standing for another few seconds before lowering himself slowly back into the chair. He looked pale now, smaller somehow, like the confident architect who managed million-dollar projects every day had disappeared, leaving behind only the wounded little boy who used to run into my arms after nightmares. Sophie finally spoke first. I never planned for things to happen this way. Ryan laughed softly under his breath, but there was no humor in it. You mean sleeping with my father? Sophie flinched at the directness of the sentence. Thomas immediately straightened. Do not talk to her like that. Ryan turned toward him so sharply the chair legs scraped against the hardwood floor again. You do not get to defend her. The room fell silent once more. Rain continued falling outside, while thunder rolled farther away now, fading slowly into the distance. I looked around the dining room at the family photographs lining the shelves near the fireplace. Birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings. Decades of smiling faces trapped inside frames, while the real damage grew quietly behind them. How long? Ryan asked again, his voice lower now. Thomas finally answered without lifting his eyes. About a year. Ryan inhaled sharply like the air itself hurt him. Sophie folded her arms tightly across herself. It was not supposed to become serious. But even she sounded uncertain now. The confidence she carried for weeks had begun cracking under the weight of reality. Ryan stared at her in disbelief. You told my mother you were carrying his child during our anniversary dinner. Sophie looked toward me briefly before lowering her eyes again. I thought she deserved honesty. I almost laughed at that. Honesty. Such a beautiful word used by people who had built entire lives around deception. Ryan pushed his chair back again and stood slowly this time. I need air. He walked out through the back door into the rain before anyone could stop him. Through the kitchen windows, I watched him stand motionless beneath the covered patio with both hands gripping the wooden railing. Thomas moved as if to follow him, but I raised one hand. Slightly. No, he looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time in months. Evelyn, do not. My voice remained calm, but something inside it made him stop speaking immediately. Sophie reached for her purse with trembling fingers. I should probably leave. Yes, I said quietly. She froze, clearly surprised by how easily I agreed. For weeks, she had expected drama. Tears. Pleading. Instead, she found something colder. Clarity. As Sophie stood from the table, I reached into the leather folder one final time and removed another set of papers. Before you go, I said softly, there is one more thing you should know. Thomas frowned immediately. Sophie hesitated beside her chair. I slid the documents slowly across the table toward them both. Trust revisions. Asset transfers. Property protections finalized 3 days earlier through my attorney downtown. Thomas picked up the papers first, confusion giving way to shock as he read. You changed the trust? Yes. His face drained of color. You cannot do that without discussing it with me. Actually, I replied calmly, I can. The original structure was established through my inheritance from my parents. You only managed it because I trusted you. The last sentence landed harder than I expected. Thomas stared at me speechless. Sophie moved closer quickly and scanned the paperwork over his shoulder. I watched panic finally replace calculation inside her eyes. What does this mean? She whispered. I folded my napkin carefully beside my empty dessert plate. It means every property connected to the family trust is now protected from external claims. Sophie's expression tightened instantly. External. You are no longer listed anywhere. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked genuinely frightened. Not because of love, not because of guilt, because the future she thought she secured was disappearing in front of her. Thomas lowered himself slowly back into his chair, as if his legs suddenly weakened beneath him. Evelyn, he said quietly, please. But there was nothing left to discuss anymore. Some damage could not be repaired with apologies once the truth fully entered the room. Outside, Ryan still stood alone beneath the rain-dark sky. I looked toward my son through the kitchen windows and realized he was the only person at that table I still wanted to protect. Sophie grabbed her coat with shaking hands. Thomas looked 20 years older than he had an hour earlier. And somewhere beneath all the heartbreak settling through the house, I finally felt something unexpected begin returning to me after months of humiliation and silence. Power. The house became quiet after that night. Not peaceful quiet. Hollow quiet. The kind that settles over a place after something important has died inside it. Sophie left first. She walked out carrying her purse and coat, without saying goodbye to anyone. The front door closed softly behind her, but the sound echoed through the entire house anyway. Thomas remained seated at the dining table long after she was gone, staring down at the trust documents like a man reading the ruins of his own decisions. Ryan stayed outside beneath the covered patio until the rain finally stopped sometime after midnight. I cleaned the kitchen alone. I wrapped untouched slices of cheesecake in plastic wrap. I rinsed wine from the white tablecloth before the stain could fully settle. I loaded plates into the dishwasher while Frank Sinatra still played quietly through the kitchen speakers because nobody had remembered to turn the music off. Strange how ordinary chores continue even when a family collapses. Around 1 in the morning, Ryan came back inside. His hair was damp from the mist outside, and his face looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. He stood silently near the kitchen island while I dried the last dinner plate with a dish towel. "Mom," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "how long have you known?" I folded the towel carefully before answering. "Long enough." He nodded slowly like he already expected that answer. Then he looked around the kitchen, at the familiar cabinets and framed photographs and half-empty wine glasses still sitting near the sink. "I feel stupid," he whispered. That hurt more than anything else. More than Thomas's betrayal. More than Sophie's manipulation. Watching my son blame himself for trusting people he loved. I walked over and touched his cheek gently the same way I used to when he was little and woke up frightened after thunderstorms. "No," I said softly. "You were loyal. Those are not the same thing." Ryan closed his eyes briefly, and for the first time all evening, I saw tears gather there. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind grown men try to hide because the world teaches them heartbreak should look smaller on them somehow. "Did Dad ever love us?" he asked. I thought about that carefully before answering. I think he loved the life we built. But somewhere along the way, he started loving himself more. Ryan stared down at the kitchen floor for several seconds. Then he nodded once and whispered goodnight before heading upstairs to the guest room. Thomas moved out 3 days later. He packed quietly while I sat on the back porch drinking coffee and watching leaves drift across the yard. Neither of us fought. There seemed little point in it now. Some endings arrive long before people finally acknowledge them out loud. Before leaving, Thomas stood awkwardly near the front door with his overnight bag resting beside him. The man in front of me barely resembled the confident husband I married decades earlier. He looked tired now, smaller, like betrayal had hollowed him out too. "I never meant for this to happen," he said quietly. I almost smiled at the absurdity of that sentence. As if lives simply fell apart on their own without people making choices over and over again. "But it did," I answered calmly. He looked at me for a long moment, maybe hoping to find anger still waiting somewhere inside me. But anger requires energy, and I no longer wanted to spend mine carrying his guilt for him. Eventually, he nodded once, picked up his bag, and walked out the front door without another word. After that, the house slowly began breathing differently. Ryan started coming by every Sunday again, sometimes helping me with repairs around the yard or bringing takeout from the Italian restaurant downtown. We rarely discussed Sophie or Thomas directly. Some wounds needed silence before they could scar properly. A month later, I heard through Clara that Sophie had moved out of the Marina condo after discovering Thomas no longer controlled access to the trust the way she believed. Funny how quickly some relationships disappear once money leaves the room. One cold November morning, I sat alone on the back porch wrapped in my old wool cardigan while sunlight broke softly through the trees behind the yard. The fountain hummed quietly beside the rose bushes Thomas once planted years ago. For the first time in months, the house no longer felt heavy. It simply felt honest. Ryan arrived carrying coffee and fresh cinnamon rolls from the bakery near the river. "Morning, Mom," he said gently as he sat beside me. I looked at my son and realized something important. Families do not always survive betrayal intact. Sometimes they become smaller, quieter, more truthful. But not everything broken stays broken forever. Ryan handed me a warm coffee cup and leaned back in the porch chair beside mine, while morning light spread slowly across the yard. Neither of us spoke for a while. We just sat there together listening to the wind move softly through the trees, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence no longer felt lonely.